but Northampton, being the county town, was always the biggest brewery. And where Carlsberg is today, and I would just like to say, those of us at Phipps send our condolences, and we're thinking about the people in hospital and the guy who died. They make lager, they're obviously a different style company to us, but we do feel a bond of brewing, and it's very sad what's happened. So Phipps continued on, family-owned company right through the 19th century, under the chairmanship of various Phipps family members, the most famous of whom was Pickering Phipps II. In the mid-Victorian era, was a colossus of the town. He was Lord Mayor, he was MP, Justice of the Peace, and he was the man that turned Phipps at one point into the largest brewery in the Midlands, bigger than Marston's or Everard's or Charles Wells. It was a giant company, and it also owned other businesses in Northampton. Phipps and Sons, which later became Chamberlain Phipps, is where the Derngate is now. That was a shoe mercers. They made eyelets and tacks and laces and anything to do with the shoe industry. It owned Hunsbury Hill Iron Works, using the hoops for the iron barrels. It had farms, it bred shy horses. It was a big company. Still a family firm. Rolls right through the 20th century, taking over many of its local regional rivals. And one of those was called Ratliff and Jeffrey. And the Jeffrey family are another big Northampton family that those of you that shop at Montague Jeffrey, and maybe Jeffrey West Shoes, it's a name that looms large in the town's history. They took over Ratliff and Jeffrey's, which was also near Bridge Street, in 1899. And Ratliff's, as people may know, was famous for brewing stout. Roll on through the 20th century, this and that and the other happened, and then into our story, ladies and gentlemen, comes the pantomime villain, Watney's. Now at this point, if you were a camera audience, you'd boo, like he's behind you. Yeah, Watney's. Watney's got rich because they invented and patented keg beer. They were a very, very rich company in the 1950s, and they were trying to buy themselves into the Premier League of British brewing, which at that time was dominated by Burton brewers, as it still is to some extent. And they did this by hostile, acquisitive takeovers. And there's it's interesting that the M1 reached Northampton in 1959, and in 1960, Watney's put this bid on the table for Phipps that sort of half the family didn't want to take, half the family did. And by that time, because brewing is a very, very good business to be in if you want to have children that survive. In the 19th century, brewers' children, because they didn't drink water, survived more than other children. So Pickering had 9 kids, and all his kids survived to childbearing age, and they all had 5, 6, 7, 8 kids. So by 1960, the shareholding was spread across many people. A bit like the Brexit vote, about 48% didn't want to sell, 52 did. So the company was sold to Watney's in 1960. And as we all hear today, I think, when a company takes over another company, there is a lot of horse shit about it's good, it's a marriage, it's investment, it'll be great. It was rubbish. Watney's were just after the pub chain, and it took them 13 years to slowly reduce all the local brewing at Bridge Street. And in 1973-4, they sold the brewery site to Carlsberg, and the company just became a pub chain. At that point, it was trading as Mann's Northampton Brewery. Watney's name had become discredited because tastes changed. Things like this, the advent of small is beautiful, the advent of going away for industrialized food, that did for Watney's. They were very much identified in the 1960s as technology. They were a company that believed in the shiny future, the white heat of technology. And they produced keg beer. And they gradually became out of step with the times in the 70s, and they eventually ended up being swept away by their owners, Grand Metropolitan. So the pub chain carried on, Mann's Northampton Brewery Company. You still see there St George and Dragon over the pub signs of some pubs. And then it was owned by Foster's, Diageo sold it. Then Scottish and Newcastle bought it. And then my brother ended up running Scottish and Newcastle's Midland pub chain in the early part of this century. Now it was called Cellar Door Limited, which was just a name